Hi and welcome to another edition of the Vinyl Record Collector. Today I'm going to be talking about an album which is a great favourite of mine from 1971. It was the 6th studio album released by Pink Floyd, and it was released on the 31st of October 1971 on Harvest label. And the album is Meddle. The cover of Meddle was designed by Pink Floyd and Hypnosis, and it's essentially, you can see it here, it's an ear underwater, which kind of makes sense in light of some of the things we're going to be talking about. And there's the inner cover. That inside gatefold actually reminds me in some ways of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The difference here is that it's black and white. Sgt. Pepper was highly colourful, and on the back of this it has the track listing as well. Well, although I'm a huge Pink Floyd fan, I have to say that Meddle is the first of their albums that really stands out to me as not having a track on it that I could say is kind of purely experimental or avant-garde or difficult to listen to. All of the tracks have a strong melodic kind of strength, and they work really, really well in terms of just listening to them musically. And I also think it's an album where Waters was really starting to find his feet in terms of the lyrics that he was writing. I know it was followed by the album Obscured by Clouds, and then on to what for many people is their favourite Floyd album, which is Dark Side of the Moon. But for me, Meddle has always been right at the very top of the tree. I think that's partly because at the time that it came out, which would have been 1972, I was kind of 16 years old, going on 17. It was still very much part of the scene when I was 17 and starting college, doing my A-levels, that kind of stuff. So Meddle was really the album that everybody was into. If you're a Pink Floyd fan, that was the album that was the summit of what they produced up until that time. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about each of the tracks before I talk about the kind of memory that this really evokes for me. Well, the opening track, One of These Days, features a heavily processed, kind of sinister sounding lyric, which is really unusual to find the drummer, Nick Mason, contributing, if you like, the lead vocal on a song. And the vocal's really weird. The lyric is really weird. It was written by Waters, but it's One of These Days I'm going to cut you into little pieces. And apparently it's a reference to the sound recordings of a popular radio DJ at the time called Jimmy Young. I mean, Jimmy Young was one of these DJs that would just talk and talk and talk over the whole record. And it really was irritating, the JY prog. And when you were a kind of teenager in those days, and particularly if you're into rock music, he wasn't really the kind of DJ that we felt at all was part of our scene. He was very much more a kind of middle of the road, fuddy-duddy kind of guy. But anyway, they wrote this track and put this lyric in, One of These Days I'm going to cut you into little pieces. And I don't think it was like a violent thing, but yet at the same time, knowing Roger Waters, maybe it was kind of more pointed than we actually give it credit for. And One of These Days has been described by the band themselves as the most collaborative piece of music they ever produced together. And that alone makes listening to that track well worthwhile. It's such a strong track. It opens up with the kind of sound of howling winds, and that really reminds me of the kind of wind-blown, blasted heath that you would have found in like a Shakespeare production of, say, Macbeth or King Lear. It's really desolate. And then over the top of that howling wind, you get first the intermittent, strongly echoed bass of Roger Waters, which comes in with no apparent rhythm initially, but then it's almost like it finds the rhythm. Obviously, that was the way it was constructed, the way it was meant to be. And suddenly you have this really kind of driving signature rhythm that goes through the whole song. And actually, one of these days becomes a very powerful piece by the end. And that then takes you into the track 2, which has this very, very different feel to it, a real tranquility, a pillow of winds, which was named after a hand in Mahjong. I've never played Mahjong, but this is just what I've read. And a pillow of winds was really very much a piece where there's a gentleness to the music. It's a strongly romantic lyric. Again, Roger Waters wrote the lyric this time. David Gilmour was the principal writer of the music. And you have this kind of gentle, almost acoustic kind of sound. And it's a track in which you strongly feel that the lyric came first and the music was written to fit the shape and the image that the lyrics brought about. That's how it seems to me. I don't know if that's the order it was done or if they sat down together to do this. But I certainly feel that the lyric is very strong in that song, and that then the music just fits it absolutely beautifully. And that's maybe a great collaboration by these two guys in particular. Track 3 on side 1 is a real tour de force. It's called Fearless. It's famous perhaps for having, right at the beginning and also very much more strongly towards the end, it has a field recording of Liverpool FC's Cop at Anfield in full voice singing You'll Never Walk Alone. And the lyric that stands out for me at the culmination of that track is fearlessly the idiot faced the crowd smiling. Merciless the magistrate turns round frowning. And who's the fool who wears the crown? For me, Roger Waters was again really getting powerful in the way he was starting to write lyrics, and the soundscape of Fearless with the crescendo of the crowd, you can feel the image of the guy turning to face the crowd and smiling. Almost, I mean, I see it as almost like orchestrating the crowd to be on the same kind of wavelength that he was on. I think it's so powerfully done. The acoustic guitar work is just out of this world on Fearless. Brilliant playing by Gilmour. If I was only going to play one track on side 1, I would always put Fearless on. Much as I love the other tracks, it just does it all for me. It checks all those right boxes. And even now when I listen to it all these years later, and I first heard this album when I was probably 17 years old. So all these years later, it still gives me goosebumps. It's that good. So even if you never listen to anything else on Meddle, check out Fearless. Now the 4th track, Tropez, has a completely different feel to it. It reminds me immediately of the kind of thing I would have heard coming out of the Hot Club in Paris. Django Reinhardt playing his guitar, really strong kind of 1930s jazz riff. And whereas A Pillow of Winds, I'd felt that the music was absolutely designed to fit the words. With Tropez, I feel completely the opposite. My feeling is that Waters really wrote this as a jazz piece, and he had in mind the jazz music before he started to write the lyric. And here is a song that he brought to the band as a finished work. And he didn't kind of bring the lyrics and say to them, look, I need some music to go with this. No, here it was a finished work. And obviously the whole band is playing on it, and they play beautifully, and Wright's piano solo in it is absolutely superb. I mean, you know, Wright could really play. Fantastic keyboardist. And here he is playing this very kind of traditional 30s jazz, very, very cleanly, absolutely perfect. It's strong, it's standalone, but I would say it's music with a secondary lyric, even though the lyric is a romantic lyric, the same as A Pillow of Winds. They're both kind of images of a night with a lover. But the one you feel is from the heart lyrically, and the other one you feel is kind of almost like just painting a scene, almost like a whimsy. That's how I feel about it. I love the track. As I reach for a peach, slide the writing down behind the sofa in Saint Tropez. I can see in my mind this image of this kind of almost like a villa in Saint Tropez, where Roger Waters is there and maybe just comes up with this idea. But whereas with A Pillow of Winds, I really imagine the scene, the emotion of that. I don't get that same intensity with Saint Tropez. Now the final track on Meddle Side 1 is another very quirky song. It's called Seamus. And again, I love this track. I love dogs. It's a big thing I have. Rescuing dogs. I have 2 dogs of my own. This is the only track that my 2 dogs listen to, because Seamus is a blues track that features a real howling dog. It's actually a collie called Seamus, and that collie belonged to a very famous person, a very famous rocker, Stevie Marriott, who at the time was with Humble Pie at the time that he had Seamus. And I don't know, maybe, Pink Floyd comes to you and they want to use your dog. I don't know how that happens. I don't even know how they managed to get Seamus to cooperate through the whole kind of 2 minutes odd that Seamus, the track, lasts. And there's also parts of it where I think, surely they must have kind of played with the speed of that, because there's some parts where the dog's howling is so perfectly in pitch with the music, and yet it's a very straightforward jazz riff that they're playing over the top of it. So it's not like they're fitting the music to the dog. So I have a strong feeling that unless they had miraculously found a kind of pitch perfect dog, which is highly unlikely, let's face it, I think that there's a certain amount of manipulation took place. So they made Seamus fit the song, but it works brilliantly. I was in the kitchen, Seamus, that's the dog, was outside, and that's just a lyric from it. And my old hound dog sat right down and cried, and then you hear him kind of howling and crying, and it puts a smile on your face. And I love that kind of thing. And that's how you close side 1. The final track takes up the entirety of side 2. It's extremely famous. It's called Echoes. It's about 23.5 minutes. It's a soundscape. It's a timescape. Reading about the background to Echoes, it was apparently lots of different kind of outtakes and unused portions of music. They then stitched together these various pieces of music into something actually that works really, really well as a single piece of music. And that's because with Echoes, it kind of starts off with like a sonar blip. And the sonar blip is actually Richard Wright just playing a note on a grand piano, and then that's kind of processed in such a way that it sounds just like a submarine underwater. And this ties in beautifully with the visual of the cover, the ear underwater. And to me, that whole thing must have driven the way Hypnosis and Pink Floyd came about designing the cover. There's no way that the cover obviously came before the music. That just wouldn't happen. So clearly I think this is the track that drove the design of the cover. So it starts out with this great kind of sonar sound, and you have to imagine, I guess I imagine that I'm kind of underwater and then emerging from the water into a scene so quintessentially British. It's like a foggy autumn day in Britain. It's maybe early morning, and the kind of muted sounds of crows emerging from the kind of the gloom but it's not so much that you can see them, it's just that you know they're there. You get these kind of sounds drifting in and out, and I think that that's such a fantastic effect. So for me, you've come out of the water, you've then come up onto the land, and now you're up on the edge of kind of a meadow. From this kind of soundscape, it moves into almost a feeling of wheeling gulls, and what to me almost seems like a Scottish castle section, where we seem to be travelling in time and space past a Scottish castle, because there's definitely a kind of bagpipe feel, you know, about 3/4 of the way through this track, before finally coming back to the submarine, with the sonar starting to come back in and the lyrics coming back in, and just very interesting lyrics with that whole track. I mean, when we used to listen to Meddle, it was always with the lights out. We would just allow our minds to explore the soundscape that they were creating. That was just how these albums work. We were experiencing the sound. You know, this album really reminds me of a time where I was probably age 17, and I had a Morris Minor car, and I think I had a crush on a girl at college, a Scottish girl, and I think it was pretty much unrequited, to be honest, and so I remember feeling pretty fed up one night, and I had a tape player in the car, just a portable tape player, and I had Meddle on a cassette. And I remember driving from my home in Wiltshire to some Cotswold village somewhere, and I parked up in a car park, and I slept in the car the night, and you know, was listening to Meddle before I fell asleep. And I woke up feeling freezing cold, of course, and you know, the sunlight streaming in through the car. And I drove home. I remember driving home feeling in a much better frame of mind, even all these years later. It's just such a fantastic album. Strong Pink Floyd album. And I think nothing about Meddle for me makes it in any way inferior to what came afterwards, to The Wall, or to Dark Side of the Moon, or to The Division Bell, or to any of them, Wish You Were Here. Any of those albums, none of them surpasses the feeling of pleasure that I get listening to Meddle. So I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of this album. If you've got memories of it, if you've got thoughts about it, where it fits in your preferences with Pink Floyd, share your thoughts with us by commenting below. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out our blog at thevinylrecordcollector.com. And remember, always stay in the groove.